Hi, I'm Patrick, and today we're going to talk about the basics of music theory, learn about scales and keys and chords, and develop a vocabulary so we can talk about music with our fellow musicians. I'll show you how to figure out which chords a song is made up of, which notes you can use to solo over it, and how to transpose, which means playing a song in different keys. Super simply. Let's start with notes. Western music, classical, rock, jazz, punk, pretty much any song you can think of is made of the same set of 12 notes. C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B. The deal with sharp notes, like C sharp or D sharp, which are written with a hash sign, just like hashtags, is that they're higher pitched than the note before them. That's what sharp means in the context of music, being higher pitched than something else. The opposite of sharp is flat, which consequently means being lower pitched than something else. This means that each sharp note can also be referred to as a flat note, relative to the one after it. So for instance, C sharp is also called D flat, and G sharp is also called A flat. Now, for any smarty pants out there pointing out that this is only true if we assume equal temperament tuning, I have 3 words for you. Yeah, you're right. Throughout this video, I'll use the sharp versions consistently to avoid confusion. Now, you might be wondering why only some of these notes, quite arbitrarily, have these flat and sharp signs, and I promise I'll explain in a few minutes when we talk about scales, so bear with me. Assuming they're in tune, every key on a piano keyboard, every fret on every string on a guitar or bass is one of these 12 notes. On a piano keyboard, you may have noticed that the black keys are laid out in groups of 2 and 3. If you look at one of the groups of 2, the white key immediately to the left of the black pair is a C note. The black key to the right of it is a C sharp, the next white key is a D, and so on. On a guitar neck, the note at each fret is 1/2 step higher than the previous one. A guitar is usually tuned so that the open string notes are E, B, G, D, A, E, going from the thinnest to the thickest, in our case from right to left. If we then go down the neck on the first string, the notes are F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A, and so on. On the second string, it's C, C sharp, D, D sharp. On the third string, it's G, G sharp, A, and we could go on, but I'm sure you get the idea. So what happens when we move through all the 12 notes? What comes after B? Not surprising for anybody familiar with the Latin alphabet, B is followed by a C, only an octave higher than the first one. That means it's the same note, but at a higher pitch. If you listen, you can hear that they're the same notes. So the notes repeat over and over with a period of 12. The distance in pitch between any 2 adjacent notes is called a half step or a semitone. So from C to C sharp is a half step, from E to F is a half step, from G sharp to A is a half step, and so on. If you pick a pair of adjacent notes and alternate between them, it's going to sound a little bit like the theme from Jaws. That's the sinister sound of a half step. An interval of 2 half steps is incredibly unsurprisingly called a whole step. So going from C to D is a whole step, and so is going from F to G. Moving on to scales, the actual building blocks of melodies and chords. A scale is essentially some subset of the 12 notes we've been talking about. In fact, if you randomly pick any set of about 5 to 10 notes out of the 12, there's probably a name for that scale. And there are lots of different scales, but fortunately, there's one kind of scale that is by far the most important and common and useful, and that's the major scale. Almost all mainstream music builds on major and minor scales, but fortunately, each minor scale is just a major scale in disguise, so we just have to learn about major scales and not even worry about minor scales for now. A major scale is constructed by starting on a particular note and then following a specific pattern until we have 7 notes. The pattern goes like this: whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step. So which notes will we get if we started on a C note? So we start on a C, then skip a whole step to D, then another whole step to E, a half step to F, a whole step to G, another whole step to A, and finally a whole step to B. The sequence of notes we get is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, which incidentally contains none of those pesky sharp notes. Looking at a piano keyboard, we notice that we've gotten exactly the white keys. This is of course no coincidence. A piano keyboard is intentionally designed so that the white keys make up exactly the C major scale. If you listen to the scale played ascending, you might recognize it as the Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La sequence.
Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti.
So what if we do the same exercise but start on a different note? Let's start with a D. Following the pattern, we get D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D. That's a D major scale. We could go on and repeat this exercise starting with each of the 12 notes, and that will give us all the major scales. So I promised earlier I'd explain why the notes are so randomly named in terms of which are called sharps or flats, and the reason is that the system is very C major centric. So the notes that belong to the C major scale got their own names, and the other notes were named sort of like an afterthought. There are some interesting historical reasons why this is the case, and if you're so inclined, you can look it up. Anyhow, major scales are super useful because most songs in rock, pop, dance music, or what have you are made up from notes from a single major scale. If a song's melody is made up of notes coming from a particular scale, we say that the song is in the key of that scale. So for instance, if a song is made up of notes from the C major scale, then we say that that song is in the key of C major. So that's all great, but it's now that we're getting to the really interesting part, which is how scales and keys relate to chords. So if you've ever wondered how chords are constructed, which chords go with a melody, or how you can figure out which chords a song is made up of, you're about to find out. Let's go back to the example of the C major scale. Now here's what we're going to do. We're going to start on the first note, and then pick the note 2 steps up, and then another 2 steps up, so we get C, E, and G. That's called a C major chord, and it sounds like this. Pretty happy, right? Now you might wonder why it's called a major chord. It's because of the relationship between the notes that belong to the chord. Remember how we talked about intervals and whole steps and half steps? If we look at the notes in between the notes of the chord, we can see that between C and E we have 4 half steps, and between C and G there's 7 half steps. Now, if we move to the next note of the scale and repeat the exercise of skipping 2 steps up the scale and then another 2, we'll get the notes D, F, and A. That's a D minor chord, and it sounds like this. You can hear that it sounds sort of sadder than the C major chord did, right? So how come this one is minor and the previous one was major? Let's look at the intervals between the notes of the chord again. Between D and A, we have 7 half steps again. But looking at the first and the second note, D and F, you'll notice that we only have 3 half steps, while we had 4 half steps in the C major chord. So the interval between the first and the last note is the same, but the middle note is half a step lower, and that's exactly what gives it its minor sad sound. So far we have C major and D minor, and we can continue by taking yet another step to the left, starting with the E note this time. If we repeat the above exercise, we'll find that we have the notes E, G, and B. And if we look at the intervals, we find the same pattern that we found in the D minor chord. 7 half steps between the first and the last note, and 3 half steps from the first to the middle one. That means that this is also a minor chord, E minor. If we repeat this exercise for each note until we get back to C, we'll get this sequence of chords. C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished. B diminished, you wonder. What's that all about? Well, to be honest, you don't really need to worry about it until one day you're going to play something classical or funky or jazzy, so for now just pretend like it doesn't exist. So what we've done now is we've constructed all the chords that belong to the key of C major, and we did it by going through each note of the scale systematically and combining it with notes 2 and 4 steps up the scale. So now that we know which chords belong to the key of C major and which notes they consist of, let's see how we go about practically playing them on a guitar or piano. Let's start with the C major chord and the guitar. The C major chord consists of the C, E, and G notes. Let's start by locating all occurrences of those notes on the fretboard. I'm just showing you the first 4 frets here, but you could of course do the exercise over the entire neck. Now that we have those notes highlighted, the task of constructing a chord boils down to picking one of those notes to play for any string we're intending to strum. In general, you want the root note of the chord, which is the first note of the 3, in this case a C, to be the lowest pitch note, or the bass note. In order to accomplish that, we're not going to strum the 6th, which is the leftmost string, and have the C on the 3rd fret of the 5th string be our bass note. Moving on to the 4th string, we're going to play the E note at the 2nd fret, and for the 3rd string, that's the G string, which means we can just leave it open, and on the 2nd string, we have a C note on the 1st fret, and finally the 1st string has an open E. On a piano, the simplest way to play the chord is to play the 3 notes of the chord simultaneously in 1 octave. So picking a C note, and then finding the nearest E and G notes above it. If we'd like to embellish it a bit, we could also add the root note 1 octave lower, adding a lower C in the bass. Another embellishment we could do is to add the 3rd note, the G, in the lower octave as well. So now that we've constructed the chords of C major and had a look at how to play them on piano and guitar, the beauty is that we can do this for any key. For instance, the key of D major that we talked about previously. So let's go ahead. The notes of D major are D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp. And if we go through each note, except the last one, which was the weird diminished chord you didn't have to worry about, and construct chords, we'll get the following sequence. D, E minor, F sharp minor, G, A, B minor. If we look at this sequence side by side with the one we got from the C major scale, a pattern emerges. We get the same pattern whichever key we would construct chords for. The first chord is a major one, the next 2 are minor, then 2 major chords, and finally a minor one. If you've been playing for a while, you've probably developed a fuzzy intuition about some of these things. You may have noticed that C chords are often found together with F and G, and sometimes with A minor and even with D minor, or similarly that E minor chords often go together with G and C and D major chords. If you have, that's great, because just learning this stuff theoretically without having any practical experience to ground it in can get pretty abstract. So anyway, now that we know that each chord of a key is built on a note of its scale, we can start thinking about chord progressions in a new way. Let's take the 50s chord progression, aka the Stand By Me changes, in C major. C, A minor, F, G. Let's look at which position in the key each of the chords have. Since C is the first chord, A minor is the sixth chord, F is the fourth chord, and G is the fifth, we can instead write the progression as 1, 6, 4, 5. So now that we're thinking of it as 1, 6, 4, 5, we can look up the chords with those numbers in any key to find out what the progression would be in that particular key. So let's see what 1, 6, 4, 5 would look like in G major. So the first chord would be G major, the sixth is E minor, the fourth is C, and the fifth is D. So we get G, E minor, C, D. If we want to play 1, 6, 4, 5 in D major, we get D, B minor, G, A. So as you can see, understanding how this works and with access to a table of all the chords and all the keys, you can easily transpose any song to any key. And if you take the time to memorize at least the most important chords and the most common keys, you'll be able to play a lot of songs in all those keys. I'd recommend starting with learning what the 1, 4, 5, and 6 chords are in the following keys: C, D, E, G, and A major. Now, you might be wondering, how do I know which key a chord progression is in the first place? Well, most of the time you can easily figure it out by a process of elimination. So let's take our 50s chord progression in G. G, E minor, C, D. If we look at the table of all the keys and try to find a row that contains all the chords, it turns out that G major is the only key that contains all those chords. The combination of the C and D major chords is a dead giveaway. If you study the table, you'll find that two major chords a whole step apart only ever occur as the fourth and fifth chords of a key. This means that whenever you see them together in a chord progression, you can fairly safely bet that you're in the key where they're the fourth and fifth chords respectively. For instance, if you see a chord progression that features F and G major chords, you're most likely in the key of C major. If you see D major and E major, you're probably in A major, and if you see A major and B major chords, you're probably in E major. So let's figure out the key of another song. Let's take Locked Out of Heaven by Bruno Mars. So the chord sequence of the verse is C, D minor, C, A sharp, F, G minor. And our chart tells us that the only key that contains all those chords is F major. To make sure we can easily play it in another key, let's look at what numbers the chords have. C is 5, D minor is 6, C again is 5, A sharp is 4, F is 1, and G minor is 2. I mentioned previously that each minor key is really just a major key in disguise. And in this case, most people would actually argue that the key is D minor, which is the so-called relative minor of F major. But I'll talk about this in more detail in a later episode. For now, it's good enough thinking about it as being in F major, because it tells us which chords we can expect to encounter in the song, and tells us which scale is the appropriate one for soloing over it, which is the F major scale. That's pretty much all the stuff I had for you in this episode, so let's do a quick recap. There are 12 notes: C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, and B. We form major scales by starting on one of those notes and following the whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step pattern. We form the chords of a key by walking through the notes of the key, stacking two additional notes on top of them, each 2 steps up the scale from the previous one. Each chord consists of 3 notes and is either a major or a minor chord, depending on the interval between the first and the second note. Thinking of chord sequences in relative terms using numbers allows us to easily play them in different keys. Often, we can identify the key of a song by a process of elimination, as there will only be one key that contains all the chords of the song. I hope this introduction has been a useful one, and that has helped demystify music theory a bit. We'll be deep diving into some of the topics we've touched on today in the coming episodes, so if anything seemed unclear or there's anything you'd like me to elaborate on, please let me know in the comments. Until next time.